Well, wonderful. Welcome back to our Bade Museum and Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley Talk Series. I'm Aaron Brody, Director of the Bade Museum at Pacific School of Religion. I'd like to take a moment to highlight our theme for this year and to briefly discuss, excuse me, how our series promotes social justice issues through meaningful dialogue. The Bade Museum is an institution dedicated to advancing knowledge of the archaeology and history of the ancient Levant. Over the course of the last few years, we at the museum have realized that such knowledge is enhanced by reflecting on and engaging with perspectives that have largely been ignored by modern day society, and as a result, have been erased from mainstream historical narratives. The Bade Museum particularly welcomes scholars who are presenting marginalized perspectives that contribute to creating better equity in scholarship and society more broadly. This year's series, Disability in the Ancient Middle East and Mediterranean, lifts up the experiences of people with disabilities whose voices have been typically overlooked in the study of the ancient world. This program bridges the past and the present through study of disability in antiquity, its contemporary reception, accessibility, and its continuing impact today, contributing to a more nuanced, inclusive, and complete narrative of the past. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker. Kyle Lewis Jordan is a freelance archaeologist and curator who specializes in the study of disability in antiquity. Born with cerebral palsy, he studied the archaeology and heritage of Egypt and the Middle East at University College London's Institute of Archaeology, after which he went on to curate multiple exhibitions on disability in the ancient world and archaeology for the Ashmolean Museum and Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. And the this is gonna be hard to pronounce, but I'll work on it. Verulamium Museums in St. Albans. Sorry for the butchering of that name. Alongside continuing to work in the museums and heritage sector as a curator, educator, and consultant on disability, Kyle is also independently continuing his research on disability in ancient Egypt and received a research associateship from the School of Advanced Studies National Center for Academic and Cultural Exchange in support and recognition of his work. And congratulations on that. That's fantastic.
Mhm.
Kyle's talk today is titled God is His Potter, Disability in Ancient Egypt. I'm thrilled to hand over the floor, so to speak, to Kyle Jordan. Kyle, the floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much, Aaron. I'm just going to switch to my presenter view. Yes, does everyone see that? Is that sharing the right screen?
Yes,
That you just, yes.
yes.
Wonderful. Okay. Uh, Good morning, afternoon, and evening to those of you joining us here today from wherever you are in the world. It's an absolute pleasure to be here to deliver the final lecture in this lecture series dedicated to exploring disability in the ancient Middle East and Mediterranean. And I want to express my thanks to Aaron, the Bade Museum, and the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley for this opportunity to come and share with you today my thoughts on some of the evidences for disability in ancient Egypt. Over the course of the next half hour or so, I will attempt to give you an overview to our approaches to thinking about disability in archaeology and how that maps onto our evidences for disability and impairment in the Egyptian archaeological record. What I hope you will take away from this talk is not only the wealth of evidence we have, but that lived experiences of disability in the ancient world were complex, and that by considering them, we not only gain a deeper appreciation of the complexity of the ancient world, but our own as well. So, to give you a bit of background as to my approach as a scholar to the study of disability in antiquity, let me first tell you a little bit about what I would like to refer to as the phases of disability in historical and archaeological scholarship. This was partly already touched upon in the wonderful talk that Hannah Vogel gave in this series that was looking at ableism within the discipline of disciplines of archaeology and Egyptology, but to just go over it briefly, I tend to break it down into three phases. One I would call a kind of dichotomy phase, and this is where, in response to the growing sort of cultural and social awareness of disability as a category in the later part of the 20th century, scholars were beginning to look towards their own kind of areas of study and think about disability for the first time. However, they were often holding it in this very dichotomous mode where it was kind of always seen as the binary to enabled experience and therefore always the worst thing. So we have this initial framing of disability always being the bedrock. And in the case of Henry Jacques Steiker, History of Disability, antiquity as well is the bedrock of all history. So going back into the far ancient past, he's saying, oh, the little we do have just illustrates the absolute dearth of of existence, essentially. So completely tossing it out of hand. Likewise, Robert Garland's Eye of the Beholder is regarding the disabled body in art and literature from the Greco-Roman world as utterly grotesque. He holds it very much in contempt. The second phase then becomes this response to that writing based on the knowledge that was created from what we refer to as the social model, this idea that disablement comes from society and from systems that are made to disable others. And so it does push back against this dichotomy in the sense that it's saying that it's not that simple, not that straightforward. And so there's been some great work in that space. However, it almost goes to the other extreme where it says that because there isn't a terminology or an idea for disability in the ancient world, like in the ancient lexicons, therefore we can't really consider that, and all we can consider is the impairments. And while that is important, I think it sometimes overlooks the ways in which the experience of disability and disablement is also something that is innate to the embodiment of those impairments and those relationships that that kind of forms with communities and societies. And so, where we are today is what I would refer to as the embodiment phase. And so this is a larger, with the larger enfranchisement of disabled people in universities, pursuing subjects like archaeology and disability studies, we're seeing an increased focus on what we refer to as the ontological experience of the body in the past. So ontology is the idea of experience, that sense of the body, how we experience things. So in archaeology, we're starting to think more about how things might have been experienced. And thus, ideas and knowledge of lived experience of impairment and disability and disablement become a framework. These, for right now, are mostly coming out in the form of edited academic volumes and theses, but show a growing potential for the consideration of disabled lives in the past and the effects that knowledge has on our present day questions and attitudes. By considering disability as a social and cultural object in and of itself, we can consider not only the systemic applications of disablement, but also theorize the disabled person's direct lived experience, still retaining that nuance of the social cultural phase, but applying it more critically by changing the focus away from the non disabled gaze to the disabled reality. So in that sense, embodiment approaches disability, seeking to encapsulate all of these experiences from the various models of disability. And in that way, we need to not confine ourselves to just one way of approaching the evidences we find for disability and impairment in the ancient past. This also helps us to engage with one key aspect of disabled people's lived experiences in the present moment, which is that the complex nuances of how we feel and experience our body minds, that is, body and mind, both in relation to ourselves and others. For sure, we reject the seeing of our bodies in a purely medicalized view, yet our embodiments may still require significant medical attention. Likewise, we may acknowledge that many of our disablements are socially constructed and can be dismantled, and should be, but there is also space to consider how, even with such barriers removed, our body minds will remain the same, and so our social and cultural experiences will still present differently to others. With all that out of the way, I always feel it's relevant as well when starting these talks to remind people about when, where, and what we are when we're talking about ancient Egypt. It's worth bearing in mind that this is a both geographic and temporal space that spans almost 6,000 years. So our archaeological record is quite vast, but that means we have to consider all of that time and all of that change that was being experienced. So there is no kind of one uniform way of approaching the idea of disability, for example, because there have been a multitude of cultures that have settled in the Nile Valley over those 6,000 years. So when we approach the evidences, we have to consider that kind of those modes of transition and transformation between cultures. We also just have to bear in mind that the Egyptians as a whole, as a collective, are experiencing a world that, contrary to what we may imagine, is not static. You know, it's not fixed in one place. The Nile River does not stay the same for 6,000 years. Every year, right up until the building of the Nasser Dam in the 1950s, 1960s, it's flooding every year. So that the channels are changing, and that affects people's lives, and as a result, also affecting their bodies. It's a risk, it's a danger, as well as with the wildlife that is living there, like hippopotamuses, for example, as you can see on the screen. And this is something that the ancient Egyptians were particularly culturally attuned to, right? So that kind of manifests in how they're also interpreting themselves and their relationship with the natural world around them. So I think that's just worth bearing in mind as a foreground when we're going in to talk about disability in ancient Egypt specifically, that this is the cultural context in which we're finding them, and that again, because of the span of this time, there's a lot to kind of get through and can't be just neatly prescribed in one way or another. Lastly, I just want to touch upon the title of this talk, God is His Potter. This comes from a passage of what we refer to as wisdom literature in Egyptology. And this particular piece comes from what is known as the Instructions of Amenemhotep. So this was first penned, we believe, sometime near the end of the New Kingdom. So Egypt's power in the world is declining. Things are changing rapidly. There's a kind of degradation of the central authority of the king, and so elite people and non-elite people in vast waves of the land are trying to figure out what comes next. And so Amenemhotep is writing to his son to kind of give him moral instruction on how to deal with these vastly changing times. And one quite commonly quoted passage from those instructions is chapter 25, and it reads, "Do not laugh at a blind man, nor taunt a dwarf, neither interfere with the condition of a disabled person. Do not taunt a man who is in the hand of God, nor scowl at him if he errs. Man is clay and straw, and God is his potter. He overthrows and he builds daily. He impoverishes 1,000 if he wishes, but he makes 1,000 into officials." Um, and what I think is really important to take away from there is that the term God, Lecture, Lord in ancient Egyptian, it can refer to the divine, as in Horus, Ra, Amun, those chief gods, but it can also refer to the king. And later on in this talk, we'll touch a bit about the role of the king with the body in ancient Egypt and in particular with disability. But just hold on to that idea. God is his potter. He overthrows and he builds daily. So, all of that out of the way, what evidences do we actually have? Well, I'm going to run through some examples with you. Going back to the earliest times in ancient Egypt, when communities are first starting to form, one of the earliest kind of practices that we see in the creation of images of the body are the creation of what we refer to as pre-dynastic ivories or pre-dynastic figurines. And what's notable amongst them is that across their production, we see so many examples of, for example, people with dwarfism, as you can see on the left and on the right. But also, we find images, for example, of for example, in the center, in the top right, we have a woman showing possible kyphosis, so a slight curvature of the spine. We also have examples of individuals whose limbs, because some of these ivories, they're made in one single piece, but some are made with detachable limbs. So we have examples of ones where limbs can be detached. But also they're not shown as just being static, as being in just one single kind of mode or position. We do find examples like in the bottom right of the center of people with dwarfism in roles such as giving childcare and giving um, uh, yeah, childcare. Sorry, I don't know why I got caught up on that one. But the point is that it does show that not only are they being incorporated into communities and recognized within communities, but they are playing an active role in these communities. And so it's about creating identities, and these identities continue to be carried forward such that when these practices of creating ivories evolve to creating these very ornate examples, which we find from the city of Hierakonpolis, which is the city of the falcons. So, where kingship in ancient Egypt really begins, these ivories were buried around early kind of representations of the king. And what they show is, beyond just the embodiments, is this idea of a shared identity around the king with these rippled hairstyles, these kind of wigs that they're wearing, the wigs that kind of later go on to be the symbol of the elites. Um, and so it's showing that not only are these communities, again, recognizing embodiment, but they are going out of their way to incorporate them into this new identity. And on the left here, I have an example of what's known as the Stela of Nefer, which comes from the first dynasty. So when kingship actually becomes established, Nefer here, which literally means beautiful, at the top of his stela, we see the ideogram for a little person, Deneg. He is the first known courtier, named courtier in ancient Egypt, which I think is quite cool. So you can see how this kind of leads on, and this is a continuing practice. And as we go even further, what's noteworthy is that this then culturally evolves over time, because, like I said, remember this is 6,000 years of history. So the Egyptians are re-excavating their own history as they're responding to, say, the flooding of the Nile and the shifting sands. So they're finding these older images, and they look at them and they go, wow, those are our ancestors. We should, we should bring this back. We should connect with them. And so these representations of dwarfism in particular are quite noteworthy because they lead to the development of the idea of the god Bez. Bez is a part man with dwarfism, part lion, who becomes very prevalent from the Middle Kingdom onwards, and he is often associated with the protection of mothers and infant children in the household. And what's so special about him and why I love him so much is that while he is seen as a minor quote unquote god, because he doesn't have his own temple, he is very present in the material world of the ancient Egyptians. He takes the form of many, many things, from jewelry to cosmetic pots, as you can see on the slide there, to bedposts, to door frames, to feeding bottles for children, to the pots that hold the very essential grains that feed everyone. He appears everywhere from the lowliest household to the realm of the king. The opening slide, and here I have this tile of Bes from the palace of Ramses II at Pyramessa. This is from one of the private apartments of the king and his family. So you see that for everyone in Egyptian society, this protective image of Bes becomes incredibly important. And the fact that they incorporate what we would recognize today as the disabled body into that shows that they don't immediately come with these pre-assumed assumptions about the capacity and capability of the disabled body as we do in the present, and with like those early scholarships I mentioned that kind of dichotomy phase that would assume that this was an outlier. Well, no, it's not an outlier. It's actually something that's very much culturally ingrained and considered in the Egyptian mind. Going a bit broader, though, how can we see other examples of disability in Egyptian art? So, a recent study by Professor Samar Kamal of Minya University in Egypt recorded an estimated 83 represented disabled figures in documented Old and Middle Kingdom tomb scenes and artifacts, representing a range of embodied physical and sensory impairments across a variety of professions. So some are on the screen here, but I'll read them out. So we have herdsmen and farmers, dancers and musicians, serving staff, metal workers, leather and rope makers, servants, but also high status roles, including priests, local governors, overseers, and supervisors. So, um, what that can kind of give us an impression of and tell us is that not only are they being recognized and their bodies being encoded in these ideas of, for example, with dwarfism and Bez, the idea of care, but they're also demonstrating how in Egyptian society, where a lot of emphasis was placed on the idea of collective um, kind of stewardship and action towards the greater good, the idea of ma'at, justice and all good things, disabled bodies and we can imagine by extension minds are being included in this in a variety of positions. So that gives us another clue that disability in ancient Egypt isn't just something that is passed offhand. It's something that is very much committed to memory, and that's the other thing that we can take away from the fact that so many of these kind of divergent bodies are being encoded into the memorial memory of the ancient Egyptians through their tomb scenes. While these are not usually public, right? They are from within the tombs. So, living people would not be seeing them once they're closed. The idea was that because they have now been encoded in this and they are there for the witness of the divine, means that the Egyptians wanted this to be remembered for themselves, for their own spirits and minds, but for the divine as well. And of course, I should recognize that we can also look at bioarchaeological remains. And I've only listed a few examples here because if I was to list them all, we would be here all evening. But suffice to say, this also gives us a good indication of the presence of people with dwarfism or the presence of people with embodiments such as cranial dimorphism or Pott's disease or cerebral palsy, even in the case of a woman known as Geheset, who I gave a talk about a few years ago. But I mentioned these bioarchaeological remains as well because just like how Rachel Kalischer, in her talk for this series about the burials in Megiddo, she mentioned how we do have limits to our bioarchaeological evidence. One is that obviously they are very heavily skewed towards the physical, the things that are not encoded, not just in soft tissues that do not remain, but also in the mind, which also cannot remain. But it's also the fact that in Egypt's case specifically, alterations, sorry, of the body are also important to remember. These are not the people who lived. They have been transformed through the process of mummification into the blessed dead. Their organs have been removed. They have been bound into cartonnage, into the mummy wrappings. So they are a new being. So while we can absolutely take some learnings away from them, we cannot draw too many quick conclusions because they only give us a fragment of their lived experience and their past. And so if we just read them based on those few encoded signs, then we tend to take a very medicalized view. And then we also run the risk of drawing too many quick conclusions about their burial and and how they were understood by their communities. I use the example here. These two pots on the very far left side are from the burial of two unsexed individuals with Pott's disease, a very early burial from the Edima necropolis. And the archaeologists who excavated them drew the very quick conclusion that because these pots were broken or misshapen, that they were meant to parallel the buried individual's, quote, brokenness or misshapenness. But again, that's taking a very modern lens view to the idea of a normal body and therefore their bodies being unnormal, for lack of a better term, when actually, for all we know, these were just the pots that were ready to hand because we find many examples of broken pots in burial contexts and in others that were still put to use. So the fact that there is this, easy parallel does not make it the actual case. And there's also something that I want to touch upon in this idea of encoding these bodies into memory isn't just to show how they are incorporated into the order of all good things. It also gives us an idea of what something that Mason Schrader touched upon in his talk about the idea of affordance. When he was talking about care, for example, and how affordances are kind of a two-way thing in which both the community and the individual with the lived embodiment plays a role in shaping how they move and go about the world, in his case with his archaeology. But in our case, looking at the evidence, we can also think about that again in the terms of the roles that people are playing. they could show signs of affordance. So the fact that, for example, on the left here we have this copy of a plaster cast of a young man with a curved spine who we believe is meant to represent an overseer because he, in his hand that's down by his side, it's got a drilled hole which probably would have held a staff of authority. Um, and these statues as well, they're usually made for people who hold quite a degree of authority. They're kind of commemorations for their own burial. Um, so it shows there that however his embodiment came to be, whether that was from birth or whether that was developed over the course of hard labor and therefore the kind of the degradation of his stature was the result of that, he is still being put into other positions to contribute to that work, and being given that affordance to enact that work. In the same way, when we think of, say, the blind musicians that was mentioned by Eric Harvey in his talk about blind Mesopotamians, uh, that also shows a sign of affordance because this example here in the top right is from an ostracon, so it's like they're a sketch basically of what would then go onto the wall. It's not just the fact that his eyes are shut and therefore closed. He's also very hunched over and he's showing folds to his skin, and that's usually a sign of age in ancient Egyptian art as well. So the fact of like this is probably something that was on set, and now he's kind of transitioned into this new role. He's found a new place in this role as a musician. And this is again backed up by the idea, a concept in ancient Egypt, which is a concept of affordance, which is the staff of old age. This comes from a much earlier piece of wisdom literature, same category as that one I mentioned earlier, the wisdoms of Amenemhotep. But this is from the instructions of Tarhotep. Tarhotep was a vizier, so he was like one of the highest officials of the land, and he is essentially asking the king to be allowed to retire. And in his opening kind of speech to the king of why he needs to retire, he is listing all of these reasons why he needs to retire. You know, his body is feeling weaker, his eyes are getting blurrier, his ears are getting deaf. There are moments he cannot recall. You know, he's losing his memory. The bones are aching, and he asks to appoint this staff of old age. And so what that is in the context of the literature is that he's talking about his successor, in this case his son. He wants to appoint someone who can then take on his roles. But there are a number of things we can draw away from this. One is that the staff is both the idea of that kind of support structure, that transition away from that form of work, and passing on that knowledge to the next generation or the next person. But it also can take the literal physical form of the staff. And in Egyptology, there has been this kind of pushback, this resistance to when we talk about staffs and staves, because they are used as symbols of authority, right? So some Egyptologists will say, but that's all they are, you know, and then so when we look at them and we find them, say, in burials, be that from individuals right up to King Tutankhamun, as you can see an example on the right, we're often told, oh, but they were just symbols, so we shouldn't think about them in their use. Which is a bit strange to me because as archaeologists, we know that objects are multimodal. You know, they can be both things at the same time. And that's also another thing is that when we talk about old age, in ancient Egypt, that is not marked by an age category like it is for us today. You know, when we have an idea of, oh, you retire by 68 in the case of the UK, for example, and that's what makes you old. In ancient Egypt, age is marked by the body. So all of these things that Tarhotep has just listed are a sign of his old age. It doesn't actually say what physical age he is. So anyone can become old by the transformation and changes of their body over time. And so these affordances, both in the kind of cultural understanding of that need to transition when someone is no longer enabled by by their work, but also that physical manifestation of the staff. And in particular with Tutankhamun's, it's quite striking and poignant because his, as you can see on the screen there, are shaped in the form of enemies. In this case, it's presented as someone that we would describe as Nubian. And that's an affordance for him in the performance of kingship because kings traditionally wore sandals in the form of enemies, but because he had a congenital clubbed foot, He could not wear those types of sandals. He actually had specially made sandals for him, as a paper from Dr. Alexander Morris told us very recently. But he could use his walking sticks to throttle his enemies instead. So they even give affordance to the king in that performance of his power. So this idea of affordance is not a modern thing, is the sum of what I'm saying. However, I ended on that idea of throttling the enemy because I do think we need to hold space when talking about disability and disablement in ancient Egypt to also think about the king himself and his right to maim. I wanted to include this, especially after listening to the wonderful talks by Huli Ramatswana and Corina Guerrero in this series, both of whom, in their own ways, touch upon this idea that we call in disability studies the politics of debilitation, right? How bodies are debilitated by power in whatever form that takes to exert it. And in this case, we see that very prevalently in the formation of kingship in ancient Egypt. The earliest representation of Pharaoh, the Nama palette, is a representation of the king about to strike his enemy and trampling his maimed enemies. And those figures I mentioned earlier, those ivories, the idea of detachable limbs, um, that is meant to evoke the idea that the king can change the body at whim. And so this takes us all the way back to God is his potter. He can make 1,000 if he wishes, but he can make 1,000 impoverished if he wishes. That's very significant. That's in his power to do so, to channel that chaotic energy. Um, and this continues on throughout Egyptian history, but I want to draw particular attention to Khafre Khemwe. Khafre Khemwe, like Naaman before him, is a unifier, right? In the Second Dynasty, he unifies the south and the north of Egypt, Lower and Upper Egypt again. And we don't know why there was a division in the first place, whether those polities just kind of separated naturally over time or whether there was civil conflict. But what we do know for sure by Khafre Khemwe's own dedication, and it's also just as a fun aside, Khafre Khemwe, this statue here is the first ever statue of a king as well. So it's poignant that the first ever representation of a king and the first ever statue of a king both show these signs of trampling and destroying the enemy. On this statue, he numbers how many northern enemies he crushed 47,209. Now, as Eric Harvey pointed out in his talk about Mesopotamia and how their numbers can be exaggerated, they can often be easily timed by a root, for example. 47,209 to me feels a bit too specific. And even if it is not the exact figure, there's another thing we have to keep in mind, and I thought about this after listening to Huli Ramatswana's talk, the idea that the enemy as a classifier is not just a combatant. In his talk, he mentioned how in modern conflict today, about 35% of casualties are children. So I think we as scholars, when we look at these images of King and we look at these images of him smiting the enemy, we have to take that focus away, not just on the king in his display of power, but thinking about the ramifications of that on the maimed, on the enemy, who is the enemy, and what happened. So, all of what I've shared with you has predominantly focused on the body, but I also want to take some time to think about the mental health in the ancient world, or the idea of the mind, and where we might get some idea of that as well. So, Egyptian medical papyri compiled records of medical treatments, which provide a list of observed symptoms, guidance on treatment and outcomes, tell us that the ancient Egyptians not only observed outward physical harms to the body, but also deeper psychological ones. In the Ebers Papyrus, one section is often referred to by Egyptologists as the Book of the Heart and speaks of symptoms such as the narrowing of the heart. Because the ancient Egyptians believed the heart was the center of one's mind and memory, this is often inferred to just suggest experiences of melancholy and depression. These depressive episodes were sometimes put down to malevolent spirits and influences from the other world who became unwelcome guests in the body or heart of the patient and had to be expelled by a combination of prayer and herbal remedy, which may in turn suggest the ancient Egyptian physicians recognized psychosomatic illnesses. In some instances, these cruel spirits could be the wandering spirits of the undead who were unsuccessful in their journey to the afterlife, and thus seek to exact their anger on the living. This is one of the many reasons why the ancient Egyptians went to such great lengths to ensure a successful journey for the deceased, including in the production of heart scarabs, amulets inscribed with magical instructions to ensure that the heart did not betray the deceased by painting them in an ill light when it was time to be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. Again, this idea of universal good or justice. The idea that your own heart could betray you gives us a very clear indication that the ancient Egyptians both recognized and directly experienced bouts of anxiety, inner turmoil, and self doubt. This is further illustrated by the rich poetic prose, often known as the discourse between a man and his soul, in which a nameless man, struggling to understand the hardships of his life and the perceived injustices of the world around him, has an argument with his own soul about the point of living. While not a direct expression of suicidal ideation, the story is a reflective discourse on the meaning of suffering, in human life. Its conclusion is open-ended, the man and his soul ultimately agreeing to face both life and death together, regardless of what the man chooses to do next. So, to bring our talk slowly to a close, I want to just touch upon finally some case studies where we can kind of bring all of these evidences together, these examples, and start to think about okay, well, then how can this help us to understand the lived experiences or cultural attitudes of the people who lived in the past. So I'll start with again this idea of funerary and commemorative art, and we'll look at two examples. The first on the left is a statue of a man with dwarfism who we know as Seneb. His name literally means healthy, and it also shows him seated beside his wife Senetites, and with two of what would ultimately be three of his children. This statue comes from his mastaba, his tomb, in the Giza necropolis. He lived during the Fifth Dynasty, during the reigns of Khufu, and um, and his son, and he was a priest, but also he was an overseer of all of the palace courtiers who had dwarfism. He was also an overseer of the granaries, so he was and cattle. His master tells us that he had 10,000 herds of cattle. Again, that number probably is an exaggeration, but it gives weight to the idea of his importance. And in his representation of himself, we can see a very clear symmetry. Symmetry is very important in Egyptian art and iconography. But traditional interpretations of Egyptian art and iconography would say that disabled bodies are asymmetrical and therefore don't fit. But very clearly here, they are making an effort to create that symmetry with his family because his children are taking the place where in mirror to their mother's legs, so it completes the picture. But also in his mastaba tomb, in representations of himself, we don't only see him performing the role of overseer in mirroring with his wife performing the role of caregiver to his children, but we also see him doing elite pastimes like sailing on the Nile. And in one scene, he is on the barge, and while that is being driven by others, attendants, he is parting the reeds. So he is playing an active role still in the driving of this bark. And that again kind of goes back to that idea of affordance. On the right, we have a stela of Roma the doorkeeper, a much later representation, and he is making an offering to the goddess Astarte. Now, again, um, traditional readings of this have said that, well, he's not Egyptian because he is giving a gift to a non-Egyptian god. That is a gross oversimplification of how the ancients felt about the identity of deities and where their realms started and ended, for one thing. But also, just by looking at it, you can very clearly see that he is presenting himself, much like Seneb in his own context, in a very Egyptian way. He is in perfect symmetry with his wife and with his child in giving the offering, but also he is presenting himself in that in that Egyptian style with the skirt, and with the beaded necklace, for example. Let alone the fact that the inscription is in hieroglyphs, and that this dedication was put along a processional route, along with many others from across the Egyptian community of his day. And these processional routes, dotted with these stela, were about commemorating the offering to the gods and this kind of collective engagement. So very obviously, just like with Zeneb, Roma is seeing himself as part of this collective whole and is commemorating himself as such. Another case study I want to touch upon is this idea of prostheses, because we do get some examples of these from the bioarchaeological record in the remains, because they are often buried with them. And like I said earlier, bioarchaeological remains can be hard to decode, and we have to be careful. And particularly with prostheses, what's so noteworthy about them? So in one case, we have this lady here who is only unfortunately known in the catalogue of the Durham Oriental Museum, where her remains currently reside, as Durham 1999.32. I prefer to call her the Lady of Akhmim. Akhmim was the town that she came from in Upper Egypt. She lived around the late period, possibly early Ptolemaic, so going into the Greek period. And she's quite unique because she had a prosthetic hand, which you can see on the bottom image there, unfortunately has been hacked off from the body, and that's a whole other thing. Maybe ask me about that. But the importance there is that it's made of cartonnage. It's being made of the very same materials that are part of her reconstitution as a divine being. So there's this direct correlation with the myth of Osiris, this idea of becoming the new being, and the new limb that is being given to you is a new limb. It's not seen as a direct one for one for the limb you lost, which is why I put prosthetics in quotations, because prosthetics today are very much meant to be a one for one for being able to work and do other activities and etc. But in the ancient world, these prosthetics aren't necessarily meant to fulfill that role. They're not there to allow someone to necessarily do all the things that they used to do with their old hand, or in the other example on the screen here, with their own foot. The cartonnage toe is quite famous, but studies have kind of concluded, well, a wearer probably wouldn't have any extra stability with this, so it's not a very functional prosthetic. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was to demonstrate that transformation of the body, that reconstitution of the body with its new forms. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about a man named Gaius Gemellus Horogenes. Horogenes was a Roman citizen who lived in a town known as Caranis, which is in the Fayum. He's a native of Antonipolis. I've mispronounced that, but the city that was dedicated to Antonius after he died. So he actually has kind of presence in several places. But what's noteworthy about him, and we know this from tax records and uh, um, tax receipts and petitions, that he was a blind man who lived at the time. He had inherited land from his father and his uncle, and in his petitions, he is reaching out to the governor of Egypt to say that he is being mistreated and targeted by the locals in Karanis because of his impairment, or that they are taking advantage of it because of his impairment. And that's significant for a number of things. One, it shows us that obviously things weren't all hunky dory. There are nuances and complexity to the lived experiences of disabled people in the past, and that is obviously something that can be relatable to today's experience. But it also shows, one, that he clearly had a support network around him in his family and in his attendants, that he was getting the support to write these petitions each time. But also for himself, it shows a very clear idea that he recognizes his blindness not as a sole part of his identity, because he also identifies himself as this Antiochian citizen, as a Roman citizen, as someone who has the rights to petition the governor. But his blindness is clearly a very core part of his representation. Ella Karev's talk in this series did talk about how the description of a person by their physical impairments could be some sort of a biometric, but the way in which he's giving his account and his description of himself doesn't really match that same formula. So it's very clearly something that he is choosing to give to his to the people who are transcribing his words for these petitions. So there's a multitude of ways in which we can infer his story, and I find it very powerful as a disabled person living in today, that despite the challenges that he was clearly up against, some quite horrible ones, he was not only prepared but willing and driven to fight his cause. So, to conclude, what I hope my talk has demonstrated is not only just the wealth of kind of potential and evidence is we have for thinking about disability in ancient Egypt. But I also hope that this talk, along with all the talks that have happened in this amazing series, have given us a chance to really think about and appreciate what disability means, not just to our understanding of the past, but to who we are today. And I hope that the overall conclusion we can draw from it is that by exploring it and by critiquing it and considering those nuances, we have a deeper appreciation of what it means to be human. Thank you.
Kyle, thank you so much for that stimulating talk. I'm still processing, I mean, not just all the wonderful theoretical information and data and case studies that you presented, but you did also such a wonderful job of weaving in the previous scholarship presented in this series. Thank you. It really
Thank
was
you.
such a great way to wrap up, a full academic year's worth um, of scholarly insights into this
Mhm.
important topic. We do have some time for questions and answers, and I'm thrilled to see a very robust live audience. That's something that we typically don't experience. Um, but I'd like to invite um, audience members, since you're in the Zoom room, if you have questions for Kyle, for our scholar, um, you can turn on your video, unmute yourself, and you can ask them directly. If you're a little shy, you can put them in the chat, I believe. Um, and I'm going to open up, I think the chat is open to everybody. Um, aha, I think we have our first question. Um, this is from Brian, one of our
Mhm.
viewers. And Brian's question is, when military service led to disability, was there special support provided by the state? I'm assuming that's the Egyptian state,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
yeah, that's Brian's question.
That's a great question, Brian. So thinking about the ancient Egyptians, if we are to kind of take the archetypal idea of the ancient Egyptian as being in the pharaonic period, because military service was up until kind of later periods wasn't a professional service. It was something that you would be conscripted into during the winter months. There wasn't really a sort of professional soldier class, with the exception of a few generals that we get names for in the New Kingdom period who seem to kind of take that role exclusively, but it doesn't seem to be something that permeates down into the everyday because people are also working in as farmers and as artisans in their day-to-day lives as well. So we don't get many evidences that I can think of for ancient Egyptians, specifically if we're thinking of pharaonic Egypt. However, when we go into the Ptolemaic and the Roman period, more broadly, we do know that there were provisions given to military veterans. Like in Rome's case, across the empire, veterans were not only for their service, they were given the land, but they were also given a pension, essentially. And quite notably, quite a few of those veterans did settle in Egypt. So because Egypt was seen not only as obviously the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, so it was a great place to situate someone who could then oversee those allotted lands and investments. In which case, Gaius Gemellus Hermogenes' kind of inheritance was from his father and uncle, who had also served in the military and gained their Roman citizenship that way. But it also ties in with how ancient Egypt kind of, or Egypt as a place rather, kind of going into later periods, is romanticized almost in a way as this place of healing and rest and recuperation. Um, I hope that answers your question.
Wonderful. Let's see. I think that Jasmine has a question and she's going to ask it directly.
Hello, Kyle. Nice to see
Hi,
you.
Jasmine. Let's see. Thank you for coming.
Always a pleasure. And this was great. Um, to everyone else, just to explain, Kyle and I know each other outside of the Zoom world. Um, I just wanted to say that I really loved your comment that um, the staff of old age is linked to sort of the physical experience of the body
Mm,
and sort of degeneration happening, and
mhm,
that it's not linked as we would think of it to like a
mm,
numerical age.
mhm,
And I wondered if we could talk a little more about, say, life expectancy in ancient Egypt, how that might change how
mm,
we think about aging and
mm,
therefore also disability.
mm. No, absolutely. It's a really pertinent topic, I think, especially when we come to interpreting bioarchaeological remains, because I'll use one example. I mentioned the lady known as Gehaset, who I gave a talk about a few years ago, and one of the things that struck me almost immediately was that because she had been diagnosed with cerebral palsy, a lot of the initial interpretations of her assumed a very diminished existence, like she was the survival of the weakest in one example. This was ignoring the fact that we could also tell from her bioarchaeological remains that she lived well into her 60s, which for ancient Egyptians is quite an advanced age. You know, the average life expectancy, bearing in mind this is also a very difficult thing for us to calculate in the first place, because obviously we can only work with the remains that we have, which are a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the remains that would have ever been. So we can never get a truly accurate idea of what life expectancy would have been like. But we estimate that a woman's average life expectancy would have been somewhere in the realm of 25 to 30 years. So in our modern times, very short time span, and it is a very short time span. But 60, which again to us is still relatively short, is actually quite advanced. So the fact that she reached that age doesn't only speak to the fact that she was accommodated and cared for and loved, but the fact that she herself had a willingness to live, contrary to how it was interpreted in the initial bioarchaeological reports, that she did not see herself as survival of the weakest. Clearly not. She lived quite a full life. We can dream to imagine, and this is where I think by incorporating lived experience, into our interpretations and bringing in people with these lived embodiments themselves to help inform our reading of these bodies, and these evidences. I think that will give us a more nuanced appreciation for the realities of living with these embodiments. Because I'm not saying it's all hunky dory either, but what I am saying is that it doesn't take away from a person's willingness to live and embrace the fullness of life.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I think Gehesa is such a fantastic example, especially because you know that she lived so long, and so you can have no doubt at all about how important she was in
Mhm.
life. I would just want to add, if I may, to that, the sort of
Please.
recognition that in those sort of bioarchaeological evidence, there's things like you see a lot of sort of osteoporosis and things that we
Yes. Yeah.
associate
Yeah.
with much people who are quite a bit older, and they're
Hmm.
appearing in people who are in their 30s and 40s.
Hmm.
So it seems to me like we have to adjust our idea of sort of the prevalence
Hmm.
of dealing with impairment in your everyday
Hmm.
life, that this could be pretty widespread, and that just
Hmm.
changes the meaning of it. In there, it's
Hmm.
normal. It, you
Yeah.
know.
Absolutely.
Just part of the
Thanks so much.
community.
Hmm.
Exactly.
Thank you, Jasmine. We have two more questions that are queued up
Hmm.
from Ben. Ben asks, oh, looks like we have a third question even. So Ben asks, are there examples of
Hmm.
things such as walkers, wheelchairs, or other accommodations besides prosthetics? Do you know if there are examples of these in the new museum at Giza?
Thank you,
Mm.
Ben. That's a lovely question. So to take that in two parts, I'll say right now that I have not had the pleasure to be to the Grand Egyptian Museum, so I can't say for sure what is and isn't there. I know that, for example, Seneb is there, and that young man with the curved spine, the overseer, is also there. So I know those representations is there. As to what accommodations are there, I'm not sure. I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't plenty of staffs and staves there. Like I talked about, we find those quite often, and so those would be the most common form of accommodation we find. Um, Walkers is quite interesting because Dr. Alexandra Morris has done a lot of great work on the Greco Egyptian god Harpocrates, who is kind of a synchronization with Horus the child, so the infant Horus who is vulnerable to his evil uncle Set, and so is being hidden away by Isis and protected by Bez as well. There are some Greek or Ptolemaic, sorry, statues and figurines that uh, she has interpreted quite well interpreted, I believe, with this kind of frame around him to assist him to walk. So the possibility of there being a walker is not improbable. Although I don't think we do have any living extant examples in the present moment, and that would likely be because of the material. Wheelchairs, no. However, one thing I didn't point out is that in one of my slides about the disability in Old Kingdom art, we do have one gentleman riding a mule in a kind of specially crafted seat. So there is the possibility that animals were used to support and assist people in moving from place to place. Although how prevalent that was, we also can't tell because again, those seats would have also been made of very easily biodegradable material. Um, but if we look just very quickly beyond ancient Egypt, with again taking that idea of wheeled chair, while physical ones would not have existed, if you look at representations of the god Hephaestus from ancient Greece, his winged chariots take on the appearance quite well of wheeled chairs. And thinking about kind of how we incorporate that into our work today, it's quite fun to think about how when you bring those representations forward to people with mobility impairments or with assisted kind of applications, one way or the other, they love to look at them and to imagine themselves in that space. And it's not about saying that that is definitively what it is, but it opens up that world to them, and that's wonderful, I think.
Thank you so much. Well, there are a bunch of other questions, so I'm just going to move right along. Let's see. I don't want to skip over anybody. Uh, ah, uh, Brian. Sorry, Brian. I don't want to butcher your last name, so I'll just call you Brian. Has a
Mhm.
question. There are examples of petitioning a deity to address a disability, such as to clear vision.
Mhm.
Was there a particular deity understand as tutelary for those
Mhm.
dealing with long-term disabilities?
Another great question, Brian. In short, there are a number of deities that would have been petitioned for kind of chronic or long-term health conditions. One would have been Tot, the god of wisdom, Jehuti, as he was known to the ancient Egyptians, so the ibis god. Along with his many wisdoms, he helped in the kind of it is imagined to have helped in the development of kind of medicine. So you see quite a lot of petitions are to him. But Isis is also a very common god that is used in petitions because she is the god of magic, and magic, Heka, as it was known in ancient Egypt, is kind of the raw power of all living things. Right, so it courses through you. So her ability to reconstitute things is quite well known, and even in the battles of Horus and Set, where they disable themselves, she reconstitutes his body in kind of taking the milk of a gazelle to pour into his eye sockets when his eyes are ripped out by Set. The new eyes become their own thing, and his old eyes, in some variations, one becomes the literal Eye of Horus, that mythological symbol that oversees
Mhm.
everything. But another version is that his eyes become the lotus flower, and the lotus flower is used in medicinal kind of in kind of like pain management, in pain relief. So
Mhm.
there's lotus power as a symbol. So there's that connotation there as well. So yeah, predominantly Tot and Isis, but you will see other names of gods pop up because there isn't a hierarchy of gods in ancient Egypt in as strict a formula as there is in say the Greco-Roman world. Even though that again is also not as entirely structured as we might first assume. But so you will find other names mentioned because there will be local kind of deities that someone might want to petition. But yes, generally Isis, Tot, and sometimes as well Imhotep, the deified Imhotep, is also because he was kind of mythologized and famed for medicinal treatments.
Fascinating. Wow, thank you. Let's see. Um, I think the next question is from Chelsea. Chelsea says, "Hey Kyle, my question would be if there is any evidence for prosthetics being made for military applications
Mm,
to enable soldiers
mm,
um, who had been disabled in battle that allowed them to
mm,
continue serving. If
mm.
so, would they have been made to be a sort of multi-tool?" Oh,
Excuse me. Hi, sis. Great question. So none from ancient Egypt. I'll just say that up front. But we do have some from the ancient Mediterranean, and because this is a talk about the ancient Mediterranean, I can include them. So we don't have any extant examples, so physical examples that we have to hand, but they are mentioned in the sources. And so a general of ancient Rome in the Second Punic War, whose name I'm afraid escapes me right now. I apologize. I'm quite tired. I've been on a kind of tour of talking for the past 3 days. So you'll have to forgive the absence of his name. But there was a very famous general who was famed for the fact that he lost his right arm, his forearm
hmm,
to his hand, in conflict with Hannibal, the very Hannibal who marched over the Alps with his elephants. He was
hmm,
captured several times by him actually, and scarred and maimed by him in several ways. Um, and Thank you, Debbie. Marcus Sergius Silas. But rather than quit the field when he lost his dominant hand, the one that would usually wield his sword,
hmm,
he had a prosthetic fashioned. So Roman prosthetics, the examples that we do have, like the Capua leg, are often made of wood, and then they're kind of plated, for lack of a better term, with bronze.
hmm,
So his was plated just like that, we're told. And so that was fashioned to his shield. So the right hand became his shield arm, and he learned how to fight with his left. So that was an example of where he himself made the active choice to go back to the battlefield because he was like, I heard no damn bell. I'm going back. So we do have examples of that from the ancient Mediterranean, but again, not in ancient Egypt's case because, again, there wasn't a sort of professional soldier class for most of pharaonic history, to the same degree as there was in Roman society, which was very much the backbone of Roman society was the soldier. Um,
hmm, 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 hmm.
yes, he did a
Wow.
Jamie Lannister, Jasmine. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I think because of the weariness of our speaker, who's just done an amazing job answering questions, we do have one last,
Mhm.
well, it's actually two.
I'm
Um,
happy to do two.
uh,
Don't worry.
okay, there's from the same audience member,
Hmm.
Miranda, says that she has two questions. Miranda, do you want to um, ask them yourself, or would you like to put them in the chat?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
We
Hmm.
can hear you great. Yeah, go for it.
Hi. Thank you so much for a fantastic lecture.
You're
I'm
welcome.
visually impaired and I'm just delighted that the struggle with bureaucracy has existed
Hmm.
since Roman
Mm.
times, because
Mm.
that's
Wow.
something that I really
Hmm.
experience.
Yeah,
But I have two questions. One
sure.
is I work in education at the Ashmolean Museum with my guide dog.
Hey.
And
Oh,
I
wow.
recently
Amazing.
received, I recently received a question from a 9-year-old who wondered if they had guide dogs in ancient Egypt. And I didn't know the
Ooh.
answer, and I figure you are the
Mm.
best person to
Mm.
ask. You already kind of answered this about the use of animals as
Mm.
mobility aids, but I wondered if
Mm.
you had any evidence for sensory disability
Mm.
animals.
So that's wonderful. First of all, I actually worked for the Ashmolean a few years ago, so it's lovely to meet
No.
someone who's also in that same context. I curated a exhibition about disability in the ancient Middle East, so we
Wow.
should separately get in touch. I'll message you my email in a moment because I'd love to hear about the work you're doing. But anyway, to answer your question, while we can't, like, on the top of my head, I can't say here is a definite example of someone with a guide dog in ancient Egypt. We do have evidence for that existing in the ancient Mediterranean. Again, we
Oh,
have on
amazing.
wall, yeah, we have wall paintings. I can't remember if this specific painting is in Pompeii or if it's in another Roman city. But we do have examples of a blind person. Yes, yes. Thank you, Debbie, once again being my savior as a classicist, with the more exact example. But yes, we do have artistic representations of people being guided by dogs, and what I
Mm,
can say about that is that, because the kind of the cohabitation of dogs and humans,
Mhm.
we evolved alongside each other so long that it is not
mhm,
out of the question to be able to imagine
mhm,
guide dogs in our parlance existing in ancient Egypt. There wouldn't have been a structure to them today like there is with training and things like that, but
mhm.
they would have been man's best friend, as they've always been. So yes, I can only imagine that blind people probably did have the companionship of animals to assist them.
That is
What
so
about
cool.
yeah, your second question?
Yeah, a lot of cultures make a connection between wisdom and age. And I was
Yes.
wondering, given the Egyptian correlation, or the Egyptian conceptualization as age being marked by the body,
Mm,
could there be something there regarding disabled people serving as ritual specialists? I wondered if you had any kind of input on that,
absolutely.
disabled people working in wisdom professions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a wonderful question, Miranda, and I think a great place to kind of wrap up and end, because I think what we can kind of infer from all of this is that because disability is something that can be congenital, but can also be something that accumulates over the course of someone's lifetime, develops over the course of someone's lifetime, and if we take this idea of age in ancient Egypt, for example, being marked by the body or transformations of the body and mind, because we should remember as well that Ptahhotep mentions forgetting, the idea of losing memory or losing track of things, um, that that is something that is experienced and encoded and embodied through that kind of interaction with the lived world. So what I mean by that is, just as you were saying, the disabled body becomes a mark of wisdom. It becomes a sign of that survival and that capacity, and also that
Nice.
ingenuity to survive as well. That's the other thing. I think when we talk about affordances, like we did in the talk, we also have to remember that that shows an ability to invent different ways of doing things, to show that sort of way of thinking around things and coming up with new ideas. So when we think about that, we can think about how, when we think about wisdom in any space or time, why do we always automatically assume an abled, predominantly white or predominantly masculine presenting body? Why is that wisdom not encoded on the disabled, on the non-white, on the feminine or non-binary body, when very clearly throughout history those have existed and have played a key role in the development of wisdom? And I think we'll leave it there.
Wow. Thank you, thank you, thank you for persevering through the exhaustion. Again, from the questions and answers, I've just really learned so much. It's just been um, uh, an incredible way to wrap up this series and an incredible honor to learn from you today, Kyle. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Well, and just by way of concluding this presentation, I'd like to tell the audience a bit about our next talk series. There'll be a bit of a hiatus for the summer, but we will resume with a new series in September. The title of that series is, drum roll please, Affordability in the Iron Age: Household, Regional, and Interregional Economies in the Levant. That series will feature 12 scholars from the United States, Europe, and the Middle East, sharing their research into the economies, trade, and interactions in the late Iron Age. So that's late first millennium, from a variety of ancient Levantine cultures. And also, once today's talk is up on the Bade Museums and the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley's YouTube channels, I'd like to ask viewers to please follow the QR code that will be posted below in the comments section in order to support future presentations like the one we just enjoyed today. I'd like to thank today's speaker, Kyle Jordan, and also to thank the museum staff and the staff at the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley. It's been a wonderful, again, a wonderful year of free online talks from our experts, and also to thank our audience. And I hope to see you all back in September. Thank you.